Clock Tower was developed by Human Entertainment, a Tokyo-based video game developer and publisher originally founded in 1983. This company was the definition of a jack-of-all-trades, making games of every genre. Sports games, puzzle games, TV show tie-ins, you name it. By the early 90s, their most successful franchises were their Formation Soccer and Fire Pro Wrestling series. And if you've never heard of either of them, I can't blame you. Neither franchise ever really left Japan for the most part. While Formation Soccer is more or less a dead franchise as far as I'm aware, believe it or not, Fire Pro Wrestling is still alive and kicking to this day. The latest entry in the franchise only released in 2017. In 1991, Hifumi Kono joined the company and began working on their pre-existing projects, but wanted to try his hand at something a bit more ambitious. Kono was a massive fan of horror films and wanted to see if he could achieve a similar atmosphere in his video game. Sure, there were a lot of horror-themed video games back then, like Castlevania and Splatterhouse, but these games just kinda had spooky themes. They weren't trying to scare you like a horror game nowadays would, and you were usually completely decked out with weapons, so there wasn't really the tension or anxiety that a survival horror usually goes for. Tension and anxiety were exactly what Kono wanted to achieve in a video game. Taking massive inspiration from films directed by Dario Argento, namely Phenomena and Suspiria, two very unique horror films that I highly recommend checking out yourself, he got to work on bringing this idea to fruition. But believe it or not, the fact Kono was able to create the game at all was purely luck. In an interview, Kono elaborated on this a bit further. Back then, Human Entertainment basically had a policy of not developing titles other than sports games. This was understandable as a management policy because it was stable and guaranteed sales, but as a developer, I was starved for an outlet to demonstrate my creativity. So, the members of the planning division negotiated with upper management to let us try our hand at an original game. As a result, all the employees decided to hold a competition where anyone could participate freely. It was open to anyone with the condition that the winner would go into full production. And luckily for Kono, he won, and Clock Tower was greenlit for development. Going into this project, Kono's biggest focus for Clock Tower was making it as cinematic as possible, at least with the technology they had at the time, and perfecting the atmosphere was the ultimate goal. Unlike other games in the 90s, he wanted the experience to be suspenseful, eerie, and, especially when you're being chased by the killer, panic-inducing. Unfortunately for those of us in the West, we never got the luxury of playing this game. Clock Tower 1 released on the SNES and later got an updated version on the PS1, but neither of these games left Japan. Good thing I'm a weeb, so Japanese won't be a problem for us. We start off the game as Jennifer Simpson, who, along with some other children from the Granite Orphanage in Norway, are on their way to meet their new adoptive family, the Barrows. At first, Jennifer feels something is very wrong in the Barrows mansion, and before long, finds herself completely on her own. Hearing a dripping sound coming from the bathroom, her morbid curiosity gets the better of her and she decides to take a look, only to find one of the other girls' dead bodies hanging in the bathtub. And this is when the game really begins. This is when we meet the Scissorman, the only actual enemy in this game. He'll relentlessly stalk you throughout the mansion until you lose him, and you'll quickly find there's absolutely no way for you to fight back. Yep, that's right, there is no combat, no weapons, or anything of the sort in Clock Tower. All you can do is run and hope you'll find a decent hiding spot. That's not the only thing you have to worry about though. You might have noticed this portrait in the corner here of Jennifer. This serves as our panic meter. It goes from blue to green to orange and finally red, and if you get caught by the Scissorman while the portrait is red, it is game over. Or a dead end, as this game calls it. Obviously, being chased by the Scissorman makes Jennifer panic, and the only way to calm her down is to rest when the coast is clear. Weirdly enough, running even when you're not in chase also raises the panic meter for some reason, which can be a little bit frustrating when you're just trying to explore and you've got Jennifer looking stressed out as all hell in the corner. But unless you just avoid running and walk everywhere in this game, which I really don't recommend because you'll be turning a 2-hour game into a 20-hour one, your portrait will be red for the majority of the playthrough. As long as you don't get too close to the Scissorman though, this isn't really a problem. Even better, this game has an autosave system, so even if you do die, you're never really set back too far. And this was a great design choice considering insta-deaths can be kinda frequent in this game. As you've probably noticed by now, this game is a good old point-and-click adventure, a staple of the 90s. Because it's a point-and-click game though, it can also have some seriously obscure puzzles, as the genre is infamously known for. Not even that the puzzles themselves are very hard, per se, just that you could walk through this room at the beginning of the game and have no clue that a key item you won't need until way later on was just sitting in this drawer the whole time, for example. I can imagine a lot of people had difficulty with this game back in the day. That being said, while the puzzles and overall difficulty may have aged like milk in this game, everything else, however, has aged like fine wine. The graphics, at least in my opinion, still hold up pretty well. They're old, sure, but the environments are so detailed and creepy and so much care has been put into the animations and character models. The graphics go a long way in keeping the atmosphere consistently eerie throughout, and considering this was a low-budget title by a very small development team, you have to give them props for how good it still looks. No two rooms look similar either, so generally speaking the mansion isn't too difficult to navigate. Your biggest problem will be the hallways, which all just look a bit too similar looking. My advice to any newcomers playing this would be to look for landmarks in the hallways, like, oh, this hallway has 2 statues, then I must be pretty close to the storage room, for example. As for music, there isn't really much when you're just exploring, so you'll be running down the endless hallways of the Barrows mansion just listening to Jennifer's footsteps, which can make moments like this all the more effective. That being said, anyone who's ever played this game will probably have very fond memories of the iconic chase music. Without a doubt though, one of the best and probably most impressive aspects of Clock Tower 1 has to be its room randomization. About half the rooms in the game and their locations will be shuffled around every playthrough, so everyone's progression of the game will be a little bit different. Because of this, the order in which you find things can change too, and you might end up coming across a scene or event that someone else could totally miss. It might take you 3 or more playthroughs to see all of the events that Clock Tower has to offer, which is impressive to this day, let alone in 1995. Take this scene for example. When you go into this room, you have a chance of coming across Mrs. Barrows. Ideally, you're meant to leave straight away if she is there, because if you don't, she'll end up poisoning you and locking you in a cell. This can lead to this entire sequence where Mrs. Barrows will kill one of the other girls right in front of you, heightening your chances of getting a bad ending. None of this will happen, however, if you run away from her before she gets the chance to poison you. There are loads of neat little variations just like this scattered across the game, and it's really impressive for a game of its age. Not only was it one of the first survival horrors ever, but the randomization means every player's first experience of the game is different. I mean, even just the way you first encounter the Scissorman can be totally different depending on where you first go. It is a survival horror, though, so how does the horror hold up? In my opinion, even to this day, Clock Tower can be pretty damn creepy. The game goes for a kind of inexplicable horror, for lack of a better word. You'll just be exploring this children's bedroom and one of the dolls will suddenly come to life. You'll innocently go and open this locker only to find a mummified creature comes to life and attacks you. Or you'll hear a ringing phone in the East Wing, and when you check it, you'll find that the cord has been cut the whole time. And none of these things are ever really explained, but that's exactly what makes it so creepy in my opinion. It's like there's terrors in this mansion beyond just the Scissorman that we'll never comprehend, and that mystery is what makes the horror so effective. The biggest and really only problem this game has is its obscure puzzles and sometimes unfair insta-deaths, but this is just the nature of playing old games now. They were harder, but that doesn't make them bad. It's just how game design was back then. So what happens in the story? Well, it's revealed to us that Mrs. Barrows actually gave birth to 2 demonic children, Bobby and Dan. Now grown up, these twins have become bloodthirsty killers, and Mrs. Barrows adopted these girls simply to bring them to the mansion as easy targets for the Scissorman. The Scissorman who has been stalking us is in fact one of those twins, Bobby. Dan, on the other hand, we find as an oversized, disfigured monster as we explore the mansion further, and we just narrowly escape him, killing him in the process. Or so we think. Climbing the clock tower, because yes, believe it or not, there is actually a clock tower in this game, we meet Mary and Bobby one final time before killing them off. Depending on which ending you get, a few of the girls can survive or only Jennifer will. Yeah, I forgot to mention that this game has multiple endings, 9 in total, believe it or not. Some ending well for Jennifer, and some ending not so well. If it wasn't immediately obvious already, I am a massive fan of Clock Tower 1. It set the standard for so many survival horror staples that we still see to this day, and even beyond that, if you have the patience to play an older game, you're just in for a damn good time. Plenty of fan translations exist for this game, so I do sincerely recommend giving this game a go if you want to go back to the roots of horror video games. And when it comes to the obscure puzzles, do just use a walkthrough, there is no shame in it. The game sold well, at least well enough to end up getting a sequel, but it seems that Clock Tower 1's influence was only properly recognised years down the line when the survival horror genre grew. Only then did people realise how much Clock Tower 1 shaped horror games as we know them today. So, the Clock Tower franchise started on a high, and the sequel had big shoes to fill. Clock Tower 2 released in 1996, finally making the leap to PS1 hardware, and this time it actually got localised in the West. 1996 was clearly a big year for horror, as the first Resident Evil also released this year. Kono even admitted that they were trying to one-up Resident Evil at the time of release, so let's have a look at how that worked out. Just as a heads up, a lot of us Westerners probably know this game as Clock Tower 1, since the first game didn't get localised and all, but for the sake of being thorough, I'm going to stick to the Japanese numbering system of this franchise. So enough of that, let's see what Clock Tower 2 has to offer. The game starts us off in a pretty cool CG intro, recapping the moment when we kill Dan in the caves. It's clear as day with this intro that Clock Tower 2 is going for more of a cheesy B-movie vibe than the first game, which was par for the course with horror games in their formative years. The graphical leap we've got going on here is pretty amazing. Gone are the flat 2D images as we make the full leap to 3D environments and characters. We start off playing this brief intro as Mr. Barton, a criminal psychologist with a fascination for the Clock Tower case, interviewing Jennifer months after the incident. It seems the events of the first game have garnered quite a bit of attention by both the police and the paparazzi, as Mr. Barton is hassled by a reporter only minutes into the game. When he returns to his office, he meets a young boy called Edward, who claims to be another survivor of the Clock Tower incident, having lost all of his memories from shock. After this intro, we can play as either one of two characters in this game, Jennifer or her guardian Helen, who also happens to be one of Mr. Barton's research assistants. In between the gameplay segments, Clock Tower 2 has these intermissions where you can visit different areas around the town and chat to other characters. I was kind of thrown off by this at first because normally I only see these kind of screens in like dating sims and visual novels, so seeing it in a horror game was a bit new to me. After popping in and saying our hellos to everyone, we come home to find the same reporter from earlier at our dorm. His name is Nolan, and at first he just seems like any old nosy reporter until... Jennifer's only 15 years old in this game. How old is this Nolan guy? Oh man, this hasn't aged well. This is like really gross. Like, what were they honestly thinking writing this narrative into a game? And no one even seems to point it out to Jennifer either. It's like written into the story as this cutesy romantic subplot. Like, oh god, that is gross, but like, okay, whatever. Anyway, after Jennifer's date, she gets home only to get attacked by a scissorman, and this is when the game finally starts. Gameplay-wise, Clock Tower 2 functions very similarly to the previous game. The character portrait from the first game is gone now, and your panic meter is instead shown on the cursor, which is actually a nice change. Selecting an item is much more fluid as well. You just hover over the top left to the item you need and tell it what to interact with. It just feels a lot snappier, so the quality of life changes made here are pretty fantastic. The panic system also has quite a few improvements in this game too. No longer are you punished for running. You can run to your heart's content and your panic meter will be unaffected. Instead, the only thing that actually raises the panic meter is directly interacting with the scissorman, like when he attacks you head on. When this happens, the cursor will flash, meaning you have to button mash to save your character. If you're attacked once, it turns orange, if you're attacked again it turns red, and if you're attacked once more it is a dead end. It's basically a more simplified, much more user-friendly version of the panic system in the first game, and it makes a world of a difference. This game is much more forgiving than the first. One interesting addition that is totally new in this game is every time you fend off the scissorman, your character will run into the nearest room automatically. I noticed sometimes that the game steered me into a room that often had a hiding spot, so I presume this was a way of helping out the player. Maybe people found hiding spots too hard to find in the first game, which I can kind of understand. The character animations are pretty nice as well. You can really tell that they were trying to make this game even more cinematic this time around, between the gameplay as well as much more cutscenes in general. This game also has voice acting now, and it's okay. The dialogue is competently written, and there's no noticeably bad performances, though Jennifer's voice actor seems a little too upbeat all the time, given the circumstances.
Oh. Nolan, you've hurt your leg!
Overall though, I would say this game is far less scary than the first game. I think the graphical update was a great leap, but a lot of the areas feel very bright and almost colourful, which kind of makes it hard to be scary. That, and I do really think they were leaning much more into that B-movie, cheesy horror kind of vibe, which I don't mind per se. I mean, I love the original Resident Evils. I just think the original game had such a strong atmosphere, and it's kind of a shame we don't get much of that here. The puzzles are a bit less obscure here too, which is a good thing. It's much clearer what you're meant to do in each area, unlike the last game where you were just kind of dropped into the mansion with little to no direction. There's also branching paths in this game. Depending on a choice you make early on, you will either go to the library to speak to a researcher, or to Rick's house, an elderly man who worked as a butler for the Barrows family, and it definitely encourages you to do another playthrough to see what you missed out on, so kudos for the replay value. It's not quite as extensive as the first game's room randomization, but it's a cool touch. Fun fact, Rick is voiced by Barry Gerd, the same voice actor as Barry from Resident Evil.
Yes, what wonderful times they were. It's you.
Barry?
I'm really embarrassed to see you now.
So now that we're all caught up on the gameplay mechanics, let's talk a little bit about the story. While the objective of the first game was primarily just to escape the Scissorman and make it out of the mansion alive, the second game's plot deals with how the demon children Bobby and Dan were born, the origins of the Barrows curse, and how to stop it. After Jennifer and Helen are attacked by the Scissorman for the first time, they start to research the Barrows family lineage, all the while trying to figure out who this Scissorman actually is. In Jennifer's route, this involves playing a segment as the creep Nolan, and then we eventually trace the Barrows family ancestry back to England. They go here in the hopes of figuring out more about the family curse and, most importantly, how to stop the Scissorman. As you can tell, there is much more to the story this time around, meaning much more cutscenes, as I mentioned, and I actually think this is exactly what holds Clock Tower 2 back. See, the first game's biggest strength was how lonely and isolated you were. Anything you found out about the Barrows family was purely through exploration or very brief encounters with the other survivors. In the second game, a lot of this plot is discussed in cutscenes with other characters, again mainly in these intermission segments, and quite simply there is just too much talking. There's not really much opportunity for the game to be scary or suspenseful when a considerable amount of your time will be spent having to go around to different areas looking for people to talk to. I wouldn't mind these segments if they were less, or if the dialogue was really valuable, but there's points in the games where it is just tedious. For example, right before you head off to the Barrows castle in England, you do the rounds to all the different areas to say your farewells. You go to Nolan and he says, "I'm gonna come with you." Like, okay. You go to the police station and the detective says, "I'm gonna come with you too." You go to like 4 different locations and have the same conversation 4 times over. It's not exactly exciting dialogue. Anyway, when you do finally go to the Barrows castle, Helen notices how some of the others are missing, Jennifer included, and you suddenly cut to Jennifer being tied up and approached by a Scissorman?
Don't be afraid, Jennifer. It's me, Harris.
Harris?
Poor girl. Don't worry. I'll help you now.
Where are we? Where is everyone? What's that costume?
He told me that if I kidnap you, he will give you to me. Jennifer!
No, don't come any closer.
Dude, what is it with the amount of creeps in this game? This is just uncomfortable. I like how the game makes Harris look like the creep, but acts like Nolan's behavior towards Jennifer is completely acceptable. Like, wow. Times really have changed, haven't they? Either way, as you explore the castle, you learn of the curse that has been plaguing the Barrows family for centuries. Every generation, a Barrows child is born with murderous tendencies. During the events of Clock Tower 1 and 2, of course, these are Bobby and Dan Barrows. It all comes to a climax in a cave under the castle, where Jennifer finds Edward, who was Dan Barrows, dressed up as the Scissorman, which doesn't really come as a shock for anyone. I mean, we saw Dan Barrows resurrect, and then we come across this kid who was somehow a victim of the Clock Tower case. I mean, it's kind of obvious. Jennifer banishes Dan using the spell she learned early in the castle, and Jennifer and Nolan are saved from the wreckage.
You know, you're tough.
No, you're just weak.
Nope, 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 nope. Anyway, that is Clock Tower 2. Yeah, no, it's a solid game. Mechanically and graphically, it is leaps and bounds out of the first game, that's for sure. I can totally see how this is considered a classic for people, considering it was the first Clock Tower to be localized, but it doesn't reach the heights that the first game does in terms of atmosphere, in my opinion, and it's just a bit too dialogue heavy, where the dialogue is also not terribly interesting, to be honest. It also has Nolan, so that definitely bumps it down a little bit. The simplicity of the first game still makes it the winner in my books, but Clock Tower 2 is a solid game in its own right. It actually did really well in the West, with a lot of people calling Scissorman the Michael Myers of video games, believe it or not. In a weird way, I found Scissorman kinda cute, especially when you hear him talking at the end.
I guess the secret is finally out, Jennifer.
However, considering it came out a few months after Resident Evil 1, it was inevitably compared to that game, with critics more or less all agreeing that it's a bit too slow-paced and not nearly as exciting as the fast-paced, action-oriented gameplay that Resident Evil had to offer. Point and click was starting to die out a bit by this point, so clearly Clock Tower needed to do something to keep up with its zombie-killing competitor, right? Well, Hifumi Kono, the creator of the franchise, kind of felt he did everything there was to do with Clock Tower. I mean, the Barrows family curse has been ended, both Scissormen are gone, what else is there to say and do? Well, that didn't stop Human Entertainment from assigning a new director, Yutaka Hirata, to the case to create a spin-off Clock Tower title. This game was to have a more Japanese setting, with enemies that deviate from the Stalker Scissorman formula we've had up till now. What we ended up getting was Clock Tower Ghosthead, or as it was known in the West, Clock Tower 2 The Struggle Within. Looking at Hirata's track record, this looks like it was his first time ever in a director role, and he's more experienced in anime and art design than he did in video games, so it was quite risky putting him in the lead role for a successful horror franchise. And, well, was it successful? No. I am not joking when I say this is possibly one of the worst games I have ever played. Hear me out. I really like to give any game the benefit of the doubt. I am willing to sit through a terrible game if I feel there is potential and something worth continuing for. There were points of playing Clock Tower Ghosthead where I sincerely regretted choosing this video topic. Let me get into it and you'll very quickly see what I'm talking about, okay? Alright, so this game too starts off with a CG cutscene, a very ominous one. We see two men in a forest digging something up before it fades to black and we're introduced to our protagonist, Alyssa Hale. Would you believe me if I told you this game is meant to be set in California? Well, this game came out in the era of jelly donuts, so it's not really surprising, but come on man, low effort, we can see Japanese in the intro.
Have a donut. That always cheers me up. Pika pika!
These donuts are great! Jelly-filled are my favorite! Nothing beats a jelly-filled donut!
First thing I noticed and really appreciated about this game is the overall visual design. Obviously we're in Japan now, not Norway, and the switch up in style is honestly quite refreshing for the franchise. You can definitely tell the director Hirata has an eye for aesthetics. This game throws us right into the action. We see a middle-aged couple in their home waiting for their niece Alyssa to arrive. When she does, no one seems to be around, and checking out the rooms nearby we find body parts stuffed into the bath with a yellow-greenish ooze across the floor. I will say, this intro really sets a bit of tension right off the bat, something Clock Tower 2 didn't manage to achieve at all in its opening cutscenes. As we explore the household further, we find one of the young daughters seems to be possessed and wants to kill Alyssa, thus introducing us to our first enemy in the game. Unlike previous Clock Towers, hiding spots aren't really much of a thing anymore. Most of the things you'll find in the environment will be actual weapons or furniture to knock out the enemies with. Nice Clock Tower 2 poster, by the way. Here's when we learn Alyssa isn't just any old regular schoolgirl. There are two souls residing in her body, Alyssa and a more vicious, murderous alter ego, Bates. I wonder what that's a reference to. As long as Alyssa's holding onto her amulet, she can keep Bates suppressed, but otherwise his soul will take over and she can do nothing to stop it. This is something you will have to manage during gameplay to progress, as some puzzles and events require Alyssa and some require Bates. If you ever want to transform into Bates, which is indicated by this purple aura, just drop off the amulet somewhere and the next time you encounter an enemy he'll show up. To transform back to Alyssa, just pick up the amulet again. There is a certain element of experimentation needed here. If you can't find out what you're meant to do as one character, transform into the other and try again. You're effectively playing as two different characters in one, and this sort of mechanic, if executed right, could be seriously impressive for such an early horror title. So in theory, this is a fantastic idea. Unfortunately, in theory are the key words here, because this is exactly where Clock Tower Ghosthead starts to fall apart. Man, where to start with this one? My first issue is how you transform into Bates. Having to purposefully be attacked by an enemy just to make him appear is kinda clunky because it means you have no choice but to increase your panic meter and put yourself in danger. And this game doesn't work like the previous two. You can't just wait for Alyssa to calm down. Here you have to find actual medkits, otherwise you will stay panicked until the end of the chapter. So the panic meter acts more like an actual health bar this time around. So you think, fine, okay, yeah, whatever, let's just look for medkits. Standard stuff, just like Resident Evil and their green herbs, just look thoroughly and you'll find something, right? This is where the next issue comes into play. Finding medkits can be tough because it feels like there's barely any to be found. Not only that, but this game can be really cruel. Everything feels like a trap. You'll interact with something completely innocently and it'll spawn an enemy after you. Like here, for example, I just interacted with this painting, it fell on the floor, and this somehow spawned the enemy to just coincidentally come in the door and find me? Look, I know the previous games had traps, so to speak, as well. You know, something that'll spawn the Scissorman, but in those games they were somewhat rare. They happened enough to keep you on your toes, but not frequent enough to make it a pain in the ass. They were thrown into the mix so that every interaction felt somewhat risky, felt like a gamble. That creates tension. But in this game, it feels like every item that isn't necessary for progressing the plot is a trap and will send an enemy after you. Now you have to go waste your time searching for something to kill off the enemy, which, much like medkits, are incredibly hard to find after a while, and Alyssa takes about 5 minutes to open a goddamn door in a house with a lot of doors! Believe me when I say, this is only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the problems in Clock Tower Ghost Head. We haven't even finished the first chapter of the game yet, so buckle up boys, I've got a lot to say about this one. So that's the chase segments. Okay, but what about the puzzles? If you thought the puzzle progression in the first Clock Tower was obscure, you're not even ready for Ghost Head's bullshit. There is no rhyme or reason to the progression in this game. The next event or cutscene you need to see could spawn at the opposite end of the house randomly. The game has an awful habit of just presuming you're gonna know what to do at every turn, which gets real tiring, and I have no shame in admitting I resorted to a walkthrough a lot for this playthrough. For example, close to the end of the chapter, you go down to Philip's study. He's freaked out and ends up attacking Alyssa and you make a run for it. But as it turns out, you need to go back to this room specifically and then return back to the study to progress the story. But that's the last thing most players would do. Why would you willingly walk back into danger, back down to a person who tried to kill you? Also, what even happened to him? Who knocked him out? There's no sign of that possessed kid anywhere. He then tells you to burn the statue, which he implies is the reason the daughter is possessed, but why didn't he just do that himself? Like, why does he tell us to do it? We just found him earlier in the chapter hiding in the corner doing nothing. What was he doing this entire time? The only saving grace of the game so far is Bates' voice acting. He's so ruthless and shamelessly evil, and his voice acting is top tier, I will give the game that. No surprise, considering his voice actor is Roger L. Jackson, the same man who voiced Ghostface in the Scream movies.
Hey, you little shit. What good is it gonna do to burn that?
Do you have a boyfriend?
No.
You never told me your name.
Why do you want to know my name?
I want to know who I'm looking at.
Anyway, we burn the statue, and that brings the first chapter to a close. Alyssa wakes up in the hospital where a detective called Alex greets her, but before long they hear a scream, and naturally, the policeman leaves the defenseless injured child on her own. We make it to the reception area and... Whoa, wait, what? A zombie? A zombie in Clock Tower? Yep, there's zombies now. You can really tell they were trying to compete with Resident Evil at this stage. They function much the same as the possessed kid in the house, though there is a big difference in this chapter. There is basically no environmental objects to help you in this entire chapter besides one broom in the girls' bathroom on the first floor. Thankfully, it's infinite use, but it does mean that every single zombie you encounter, you have to bring them back down to the first floor to get rid of them. We come across Alex again, which would be a great time to ask him about all these zombies. Okay. This chapter requires a lot of jumping between Alyssa and Bates, which gets just as tiring as it sounds. Up until now, all the zombies can be easily dispatched with either the good old broom method or with a single gunshot as baits. Towards the end of the chapter, we learn about what has actually happened to everyone in the hospital. Turns out there is a bacterial infection that takes over their brain, causing them to turn into zombies.
That means the zombie's weak point is their parasitic brain. Gotta try.
But when I try to do it, the cursor doesn't really let me aim at the head, it just keeps snapping to the body. Come on, like what the hell? Oh, yeah, cool, I'm dead. You also can't use environmental objects like Alyssa when you're playing as Bates, so our broom method is out of the question now. So off I went on my wild goose chase looking for bullets. you better get the hang of using a gun here because at the end of the chapter you have to shoot 30 zombies, back to back, without taking a single hit. Turns out to shoot a zombie in the head, you gotta aim more at their chest. Good to know, game, thanks. We're on to the final chapters, ladies and gentlemen, and also, by far, the worst chapter. Let's go. Alyssa wakes up in Memorial Pharmaceutical Research Lab. Turns out Alex suspects her uncle Philip to be behind all this, and brought us along for the ride to find him, because after all, it's a policeman's job to bring us right into the danger and not away from it, right? Here we finally meet the titular Ghost Head, which is the closest we have to a Scissorman-type enemy in this game. He's a man wearing an Oni mask and dragging a massive hatchet, but really he can be taken out just like any other enemy in the game. Now, this area is massive, and all the hallways look the exact same, which is really frustrating when the game started out with such promising environmental design. The house in the first chapter was pretty easy to navigate and was quite a nice looking area in general, definitely nicer than any of the areas in Clock Tower 2 in my opinion. But between the hospital and the lab, the rest of the game is just in these ugly, grey clinical settings, which is kinda disappointing to be honest. Not to mention, it is borderline impossible to navigate this area without a map. Half of the hallways and rooms are recycled just to pad the final chapter as much as possible, and it doesn't end there. Get this, in this entire lab, much like the hospital, there is basically only one method of killing every enemy in the area. It's this one fire extinguisher sitting in one of the first hallways you walk through. It's unlimited use, yes, but just like the broom method, it means that every single enemy you encounter, you have to drag them back here, kill them with the fire extinguisher, and then run all the way back. You can't run around them, and it's not worth transforming into baits, because you don't even have close to enough bullets to take out every enemy in the lab. This chapter took me almost 2 hours to beat, so I counted, out of curiosity, how much of my playtime was purely spent backtracking back to that godforsaken fire extinguisher. Almost half of that. Out of almost 2 hours playtime, over 50 minutes was spent running back to the exact same hallway, using the exact same elevators, running through the exact same labs, just to go back to one of the first hallways to knock out these terribly designed enemies in this terribly designed game.
Yeah, this is some kind of place, isn't it? Creature that bleeds yellow blood, hatchet-wielding killer. You'd better get out of here quick.
Dude, it's literally your fault that we're here in the first place, but okay. So okay, but after all that, is the ending at least worth the effort? After one final, unexpected button-mashing section, we learn the truth about everything. We find Alyssa's father, Alan, speaking to Ghosthead, who is revealed to be George Maxwell. As it turns out, George Maxwell is Alyssa's actual father, and she was born as one of 2 twins. These twins were supposed to die by being buried alive due to suffering from the Maxwell curse, something that has plagued the family lineage for generations, and the cause of Bates' cruel, murderous nature, much like the Barrows family curse in the previous 2 games. But Alan, in an act of spite, decided to save them both before dying. Bates died of suffocation before they were saved, and instead became a cruel alter ego of Alyssa, in essence living on with Alyssa's body as a vessel. The story is not bad. However, it is told incredibly poorly, and combine that with the cruel game design and progression, the story is simply not worth the effort. As if incredibly obtuse progression and painfully abstract puzzles that the game just presumes you'll understand weren't enough, the enemies are intentionally designed in a way to completely overwhelm the player, with only 2 to 3 consistent methods to fight back, like the fire extinguisher and broom method, in the entire game. This game is a test of patience that nobody asked for. If you're a game designer and want to know how to not design a game, play this because trust me, you will learn very quickly. One last thing to say about this game. If you actually manage to make it to the 3rd chapter, you'll probably have this happen to you.
Everyone must die.
Yep, that's an ending. A samurai suit falls from the sky and crushes you. That's it. You probably don't even remember that we passed this samurai suit earlier in the game. All the way back in the house. Yep, you need to interact with the samurai at a very particular point of that chapter to make it come alive. If you don't do that, you'll go through the entire game just like I did, only to get this complete middle finger of an ending. It's all the way back to the beginning for you if you want to try get an actual decent ending at the game. The only thing that isn't viciously flawed in this game is its soundtrack, and thankfully you don't need to go anywhere near the game to hear that. I recommend giving the soundtrack a listen, calling it a day, and never thinking about Clock Tower Ghost Head ever again, because that's sure as hell what I'm going to be doing.
Ah, you cursed wench.
Unsurprisingly, everyone hated this game. Critics struggled to find a single positive about it at all. Combine that with the fact that Resident Evil 2, still one of the most highly regarded horror games ever made, came out almost 2 years before Clock Tower Ghost Head. Irreparable damage was done to this franchise that, as far as I'm concerned, meant Clock Tower's fate was sealed no matter what could come after. The franchise went into a brief hiatus, mainly because Human Entertainment, the developers, went bankrupt in 2000. Rest in peace. The franchise was acquired by Sunsoft, a Japanese game developer with a similar history to Human Entertainment, having made lots of arcade and movie tie-in games in the 80s and 90s. In 2001, they announced a new Clock Tower was being co-developed with Capcom. So, Clock Tower ended up in the hands of Capcom, the very people who made its biggest competitor, Resident Evil. Well, if you can't beat them, join them. Sunsoft and Capcom really went hell for leather, making this a strong comeback for the Clock Tower franchise. This time, they were not going to make the same mistakes of imitating their competitors, which frankly would have been an impossible task considering Resident Evil and Silent Hill were dominating the horror genre in the early 2000s, dropping bangers like Code Veronica and Silent Hill 3 around the same time. No, instead they went in a completely different direction, and let me tell you, they had some serious star power behind this project. Kinji Fukasaku was on board directing the cutscenes, a well-known Japanese film director who had decades of experience directing Yakuza, samurai, and war films, with probably his most well-known film in the West being the Battle Royale film adaptation. Keita Amemiya was on board for the character designs, with ample experience designing characters for Japanese superhero films and anime like Kamen Rider and Ultraman. Then we've got Noboru Sugimura in charge of the scenario writing, who was also a scenario writer for Dino Crisis, Resident Evil, and when it came to anime, Lupin III. Surely this means the game is a guaranteed success, right? I mean, how can you go wrong with that lineup? Well, let's jump in and see how Clock Tower 3, the final installment in the Clock Tower franchise, turned out. Well, for starters, what a graphical leap. The CG cutscenes in particular in this game look absolutely phenomenal, but the in-game graphics and animations are great too. It's definitely a very pretty looking game so far. We are playing as Alyssa Hamilton, a 14-year-old English girl. Wait, what? Alyssa? Did they seriously just release 2 games back to back with protagonists called Alyssa? Awkward. Well, I mean, to be fair, Alyssa in Clock Tower Ghost Head is technically called Yu Midoshima in the Japanese version of the game. I guess it was just super unlucky that the next game's character was canonically called Alyssa. Damn. I mean, if they really wanted to avoid this, they could have just renamed her anything else, but whatever. I guess, much like me, even the localizers like to think Ghost Head doesn't exist. Anyway, we're playing as Alyssa Hamilton, a young girl away at boarding school who gets a worrying letter from her mother telling her she's in danger and needs to hide. Obviously concerned, she goes home to find no one there except a strange man telling her that her mother is gone forever. Before she gets much opportunity to take all this in, she's whisked away in the blink of an eye back to a war-torn London in 1942. While I give you a second to digest everything I've just said, let's discuss the gameplay a bit here. Gameplay this time around completely ditches the point-and-click style of previous games. This time we actually directly control Alyssa, as Clock Tower 3 opts for the good old fixed camera angle gameplay. We also have our stalker enemies, who you can either hide from or attack with an environmental weapon. You're never too far away from one of these, as they're usually indicated by this green symbol here. The panic meter returns, as you can see, and naturally enough being attacked by the enemy raises it, but for the first time in the franchise, we have a lot of items to fight back with this time. For one, we have Holy Water, which you have to refill at the save points throughout the game. It's mainly used for story progression and puzzles, but you can use it on enemies if they get too close and it'll temporarily stun them. It's a great last-ditch attempt at slowing down the enemy if they get too close, and it comes in clutch a lot as you play. There are also some items that you can find naturally as you explore, like lavender water, which completely reduces your panic meter to 0 after a few seconds, invisibility bands, which obviously make you invisible for a few seconds, and sigil stones, which kind of act as a buffer. If you get hit after using one, you will take absolutely no damage. All of these items are really handy, and I found myself using all of them pretty equally in my playthrough, but the lavender water in particular is a godsend. These also work on spirits, which you will come across as you explore as well. These are people who've died with unfinished business on Earth, so usually you have to find a sentimental item or other belonging to lay them to rest. It helps to get them out of the way, but it is ultimately optional whether or not you choose to deal with them. A few minutes in and I can already tell by far that Clock Tower 3 is, by modern standards, one of the most accessible horror games, and definitely the most accessible and beginner-friendly Clock Tower. The same goes for the puzzles. There are some brain teasers in there for sure, but nothing that'll have you stumped for too long. Most of the puzzles are very logical, and as long as you explore sufficiently, you've really got nothing to worry about. Okay, now, back to the story. We soon learn that Alyssa is part of a lineage of rooters. Rooters are effectively time-travelling warriors who go back to different parts of history to take down entities. Entities are dark evil forces that possess violent, murderous people to continue their rampage. These possessed murderers are then called subordinates, and with every murder at their hand, the entity becomes stronger. It's a rooter's job then to go back in time and take down these subordinates. As we explore, we find newspaper clippings and reports about the murderer's history, and it really adds to the atmosphere, piecing together a personality and motive for each of the enemies we face.
I've been making this in my spare time. How is it? Warm enough?
It's lovely. So warm and soft. Thank you. Thank you so much.
That's enough playing happy families. You make me sick.
This plot is really cool. I mean, it's super out there, but I can't really say I've played any other game like it. Not only that, but the presentation is absolutely nuts, especially the cutscenes. It's so theatrical and campy, and I'm a sucker for anything campy, so this game appeals to all of my tastes.
Nice to meet you, Alyssa. You have some remarkable powers.
But no one is powerful enough to defeat us. If you want your friend alive, give us your heart so we can create a new entity. Dennis!
When you finally have a showdown with the subordinates, there'll be this magical Sailor Moon type cutscene, and Alyssa gets this bow and arrow out of nowhere that she uses to take down the enemy. Like, dude, this game just keeps getting better and better. The boss fights are interesting too. You effectively have to trap the subordinate using these orbs you shoot at them before you can unleash this really sick finishing move on them, with an animation that just straight up looks like a Final Fantasy summon. How are we still playing a Clock Tower game? This is crazy. The campiness extends beyond just the enemies though. Alyssa's friend Dennis helps her out throughout the game, and even in these normal cutscenes between the characters, they are so lively and animated all the time. It just straight up feels like they were trying to make a video game that feels like a stage play, and it just works wonderfully. Now, the only thing I will say lets it down is the English voice acting, which, while perfectly competent, doesn't feel like it matches the energy of what's happening on screen. If they were going for that theatrical style, you'd think the characters should speak in an equally theatrical way, but that just isn't the case, and can lead to some really jarring, awkward cutscenes. I noticed that the Japanese voice acting really commits to that over-the-top style though, so I think the localizing team just didn't understand the assignment.
Mother always has this key with her. What are you doing with it? You saw her? When? And where?
Calm down, calm down. It was yesterday morning and your mother drove by in her car. Oops. And she said you might come back from boarding school and asked me to hand that key to you if you wasn't back in time.
じいちゃんの部屋の鍵だわ。ママが持ってたのよこれ。どうしてあなた。ママに会ったのね。いつどこで。
昨日の朝だよ。川向こうの公園でチビたちとクリケットやってたらお前のママが通りかかってでお前が帰ってくるかもしれないからそれまでに戻らなかったらそれを渡してくれって。
Now, I know this super campy style is not to everyone's taste. I mean, it's not exactly what you're expecting when you play a horror game, so to a lot of people that would make this a bad horror game, but I could not disagree more. To me, horror doesn't always have to be scary. It can just be a horrifying situation that the protagonist is in, and that still makes it a valid horror game to me. What matters more is the execution, and more importantly, did you, the player, have a good time? Scared or not, there are simply not many games out there with the storytelling, style, and craziness of Clock Tower 3, and I most certainly had a very fun time playing this game. The franchise took such a vastly different direction with its style, and it's come a long way from the point-and-click horror of Clock Tower 1. But considering it was competing with Resident Evil and Silent Hill, which frankly were much better at horror than Clock Tower 2 and Ghost Head could ever hope to be, the devs played it smart and did something no other mainstream horror was doing. Theatrical, bombastic, zany horror, and it does it with pride. I mean, I said the game isn't scary, but I'd be lying if I said these sudden jump scares didn't make me jump every damn time. Not only does a rooter have to take down the entities, but also bring peace to their victims. For example, at the beginning of the game in 1940s London, we bring closure to one of the victims by bringing them their father's pocket watch, who unfortunately died at war. This leads to some unexpectedly heartfelt and emotional moments in the story, something that previous Clock Towers always lacked, and it's executed so well. This game is a total roller coaster of emotions, but I am so here for it. As we progress through the game, we learn about the ritual of engagement. In order to become an entity, someone related to a rooter must take their heart and drink their blood. One of Alyssa's ancestors, Lord Burroughs, sounds a lot like Barrows, tried and failed to complete the ritual, and now her grandfather wants to finish what he started. Lord Burroughs fused his soul with her grandfather to finally complete this ritual of engagement with Alyssa, and this is the final boss of the game. This final boss is also incredibly bullshit. Up until now, the enemies in this game were fairly manageable. Some subordinates were a little bit trickier than others, but usually took no more than 2 to 3 attempts. This guy's health bar is just unnecessary. I mean, are you seeing this shit? And are you seeing how much damage I'm doing? Like, not to mention, he spams like the same 3 moves over and over again. If he manages to hit you 3 times, it is game over and you gotta try all over again. All you can do is painstakingly whittle down his health at a snail's pace, which is really hard when he keeps moving all the time. Like, god damn it, stay still. This final boss is such whiplash after the game being pretty easy up until now, and I'm convinced this difficulty spike was just to pad out this game. Because believe it or not, Clock Tower 3 will probably only take you about 4 hours or so to beat. Short, yes, but just the right length for what it tries to do. Any longer, and I think it would have lost its charm and just become tedious. This final boss can get in the bin though. So, what do I think of Clock Tower 3? It is a total winner to me. Very different from everything in the franchise up until now, yes, but it was such a drastic change of direction for the series and it just worked in my opinion. If you're open-minded enough to go for a little camp horror meets Sailor Moon type game, you're in for quite the unforgettable experience. It's also a very easy game, bar this asshole, so for someone wanting to jump into the world of retro horror in the modern age, this game's a pretty great place to start. Unfortunately, most people didn't seem to share this sentiment back in the day. The game did not do well at all in sales. Capcom projected sales of 450,000 units, but it didn't even come close, barely scraping 120,000 units. Which is a shame, because critics were generally positive about this game, but I think Clock Tower 3 is just a little too out there for the general audience. The game is very much a cult classic, and frankly I'm not surprised it wasn't a hit. Clock Tower 3 is an acquired taste, as is camp horror as a whole. It's a shame, considering all the wonderfully talented people who were involved in its production. As if Ghosthead wasn't already a massive failure, Clock Tower 3, despite being a good game, was the final nail in the coffin. It seems Sunsoft's only attempt at the Clock Tower franchise scared them out of ever trying anything else with the IP, and the franchise has been dormant ever since. We are closing in on nearly 20 years since we last got an official Clock Tower title. Sunsoft still owns the rights, but have since moved on to making other games, so the likelihood of them ever returning feels very unlikely, at least right now. Unless they sell out the rights, I don't see us getting anything new from the Clock Tower franchise anytime soon. So where would I rank these games? If you're looking for an actual spooky experience, try Clock Tower 1. If you're looking for more of that, Clock Tower 2 is a fine sequel, but just not as good, in my opinion. If you're looking for a good beginner-friendly entry and like the idea of a theatrical, campy horror experience, Clock Tower 3 is the way to go. And if you hate yourself, Clock Tower Ghosthead is the game for you. While this franchise is dead in the ground as far as I'm concerned, its influence knows no bounds. As much as people like to gloss over it in favour of Silent Hill and Resident Evil, these games just wouldn't exist if it wasn't for Clock Tower paving the way before it. It's a shame what became of the franchise, but it feels like it just wasn't able to keep up with its competitors. And while I appreciate the direction it took in Clock Tower 3, its niche style mixed with probably a bad reputation after Ghosthead cemented Clock Tower's fate. Though all hope is not lost, there have been plenty games since that have tried to replicate the vibe of a Clock Tower. I mean, the remothered franchise apparently started out as a fan remake of Clock Tower 1, and lots of games since, like Eternal Darkness and Amnesia, have drawn inspiration from what is probably Clock Tower's most unique feature, the panic system. There are even some games that are considered spiritual successors to Clock Tower, some that are good and some that are Nightcry. Oh man. Nightcry, yeah, you know, to this day, Nightcry is still the only game I have ever rage quit. Yeah, but I mean, if I've revisited Clock Tower, I think it's only fair that I revisit Nightcry as well, especially considering it was directed by Hifumi Kono himself, the creator of Clock Tower. So, you know, maybe it has something going for it, right? Man, the shit I do for you guys, I swear. So, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed revisiting the wonderful but flawed franchise that is Clock Tower with me. I do stream lots of retro and indie horror similar to this over on my Twitch 3 times a week, so do hit me up there if you like the vibes, and Twitter too, obviously. But once again, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time for some Night Cry! Woo! Bye-bye.